What's up YouTube, it's White Mike, and today I wanted to talk about the Sony A7 IV and specifically what my thoughts are around this camera. I meant to make a video about the potential specs as well as when it was announced, but as with everything, life happens and other things take priority, but we're back. So before we get started, if you aren't already subscribed to the channel and want to see more content just like this, please consider subscribing as well as hitting that like button, as it really helps me out. So jumping into the details here, the Sony A7 IV is a great upgrade from the A7 III in my opinion. And if you're a video shooter, it's almost made the A7 III obsolete unless you're just on a budget or need a B cam or something that doesn't need crazy new technology and specs. So the new camera has the following specs. That's 33 megapixel backside illuminated full frame CMOS sensor, which is a ton more than the 12 on my A7S III. You get up to 15 stops of dynamic range, which is pretty much the Sony standard these days. The ISO range is 100 to 51,200. Now you can go into the expanded mode and get 50 to 204,800. And for movies, that's 100 to 102,400. Now I believe the A7S III can go lower than 100 natively without the expanded, and you do get some, better ISO performance there. The autofocus covers up to 94% of the image area with 759 phase detect autofocus points. That's 425 contrast detect points. Now that also depends on which mode you're in. You also get AI-based real-time tracking, which is now in the entry-level camera. The A7 IV is the entry-level camera. It now is up to date with the S3, the ZV-E10, the A1, the A9, the 6600. Basically, it's pretty much overdue at this point. The IAF now includes humans, animals, and birds. The S3 still hasn't gotten the birds update, but hopefully it gets it soon, even though I personally don't shoot birds. You do get up to 10 frames per second in photo mode for both mechanical and electronic shutter modes, so that's always great. The video mode has been really upgraded, so you can finally do 422 10-bit with options for long GOP or all intra encoding with unlimited recording time. So no more recording limit, you finally get 10-bit 422, no more 420 8-bit. But you will note that you do need V90 cards or CX Express Type A to take advantage of these higher bit rates, which when I got my S3, I had to go out and invest in some V90 cards. They're quite expensive compared to the normal ones. You can still use those normal cards for certain video formats, but for the good stuff, you will definitely need those V90 cards or CX Express Type A. You do get up to 4K 30p and 7K oversample. That's 7032 by 3958, which gets sampled down to 3840 by 2160, and that is a 16 by 9 kind of ratio. You get up to 4K 60p in slow motion. That's full pixel readout, which is Super 35 cropped. Now, some people may say that's a big issue. I don't see a problem with it. You just cannot do a full sample on a 7K sensor in 60p with the processing that it has, or at least they didn't want to do it. So it could have, gotten hot or, limited recording times, etc. So I don't see a problem with it. It's pretty common to have those crop modes, but it would have been nice to maybe had a full frame option there that even if it did line skipping, that's one way they usually get around it. But nonetheless, at least it has 4K 60. We finally get S-Cinetone in the entry-level camera, which was in the S3, the A1. A lot of the newer cameras are getting this. It's from their cinema line. It's very nice if you don't want to do a lot of grading. I personally don't use it all that much. I exclusively use S-Log3, especially with the S3. In some of the older cameras, or like the ZV-E10, I use S-Log2, and that's what I would recommend as well. But you do get usable S-Log3 in the A7 IV now because, you have that 422 10-bit. You get the 5-axis IBIS as usual with active mode now, which is in the A7S III, which is really nice. I mean, it steadies like crazy. I think there's a 10% crop here, so it's probably about the same amount of crop on the A7 IV. I didn't really check that detail, but I'm assuming it's probably very close. Whereas the ZV-E10 is pretty bad. It doesn't have IBIS, but with the active mode, it's a 50% crop, which is crazy. The A7 IV now comes with the A7S III body style and form factor with the flippy screen, new menu, better ergonomics. That includes a full-size HDMI, touchscreen, relocated record button, but you only get a single CF Express A slot. However, the A7 IV does get an upgraded dial, which has dedicated modes for photo, video, and S&Q. Now the standard dial does have an S&Q, a photo and a video mode, but this one will be under there where you can, you know, change the modes on top compared to the one on the bottom. Now I don't mind the single dial. I'm either in video or manual anyways, but I mean, it's good that they're trying out new stuff to see if they're, you know, people like it. So I think people really seem to like it. The rear dial is now customizable, so you don't have to use it as exposure compensation. So the rear dial, you know, it has the markings for exposure compensation. Now it's kind of blank, and you can basically remap to anything that they give you an option to map it to. It's a very limited list, but I'll put that up on the screen so you can see it. You do get a higher resolution 3.68 million dot OLED viewfinder, which is better than the A7 III's, but still not as good as the, you know, A7S III or the A1. There are some software based compensations and features that you don't get in the S3 yet, but I'm hopeful, and that is breathing compensation for the Sony lenses. So if you have a lens with a lens breathing issue, such as, you know, I don't know, I think the 16-35 may have a little bit of it, and you focus from one place to another, sometimes the framing changes, this will compensate for that. But if you look at their footnotes, it doesn't guarantee that it's perfect, and you shouldn't expect it to be. Sometimes there's distortion and things like that. Similar to like you see with a warp stabilizer. So you may get some wobbles in the corners and things like that. You do get a focus map feature, which is pretty cool. It lets you visualize the depth of field when shooting and lets you know what's in focus and what's not in focus. So that would be a welcome option here too. But it basically just puts little squares on the screen and color codes them based on what's in focus and how the depth of field is. The other thing is Sony flashes will now coordinate with face detect system for proper exposure and skin tones, which is pretty cool. Although I personally use Godox flashes, this might be something to look into, and not really I heard talked about much. But I guess if you're running gun with a single flash, you would want it to kind of TTL on that person's face to get that correctly exposed. I don't personally use TTL, but I can see the usefulness of it. Now that you have the rundown, what are my thoughts on the camera? Well, for one, this is definitely a step up from the A7 III and would highly recommend this as the go-to camera for anyone starting out with full frame and wanting to get into the Sony ecosystem. And for the price, you really can't go wrong. Now, if you're on a budget for full frame, go for the A7 III. They should be rather cheap. But if you want a crop sensor camera, maybe a 6600, it has some better features than the A7 III. But again, you are dealing with a crop sensor. Now, if you're on a super budget, I would recommend the ZV-E10 because it's an amazing camera, just not weather sealed, doesn't have IBIS, but I mean, you get everything else. There was a lot of stuff here, and I think, you know, we all expected or at least wanted all this stuff in a camera, and Sony delivered. We are at a point now in the Sony ecosystem though, at least, where all the cameras are starting to be really good at both photo and video. So aside from some missing professional features, I don't really think you'll be able to make a bad choice in a new camera in the coming years. The A7 IV is definitely one that I want to add to my kit, and I think it will complement my A7S III very well. And I did want to add that I had a whole A7 IV features video planned out since February of last year that I didn't get to shoot, and it was just me predicting the specs of the camera, and for the most part I was about 90% correct, except for the viewfinder resolution. I thought maybe there would be an 8K downsample instead of 7K, and I was hoping for some raw video options. I even have the price correct, and this was before any leaks, so I'd say I'm pretty familiar with these Sony cameras nonetheless. So there's some missed opportunities with this camera. I think that the A7 IV really just missed raw recording. Now I understand it's entry level and they want to make the A7S III stand out, but at a minimum, add a paid option to unlock raw recording up to 4K 60. I think the main issue here would be that it does a 7K downsample most of the time, and with RAW, that really records the entire sensor. So they would have to output a 7K image, and they're not gonna do that. Or it might be a 8K image, 3 to 4, because I know the 4K image in the S3 comes out to a 4.2K image when you do RAW. So they would have to put all that information out, and they're not gonna give you 60 frames per second. But even that at 24p would have been cool. But I even would have been happy with a Super 35 RAW. So I don't even know if that's possible, but a RAW recording of just the center portion of the sensor up to 4K 60 would have been really dope. And I think a lot of us would have paid for that. So the other thing I think that they missed here was dual CF Express Type A slots. I think if Sony wants to move forward with CF Express Type A as a future of storage formats, they should have made this a dual slot camera for Type A. I mean, it doesn't hurt anything. it might be a slightly more costly option, but you'd make that up in CF Express Type A card sales, or maybe offer two versions of the camera, one with a single and one with a dual slot. I think a lot of people complain that both slots aren't the same speed, so if they're doing Type A in one slot, they want to do it in both, so that is an advantage to the A7S III there. So speaking of that, how does the A7 IV stack up to the A7S III? Well, the A7 IV comes in at $24.99, which I think is a decent price. The S3 comes in at $34.99. There is a $1,000 difference here, but you do get some benefits with the S3, such as somewhat of a better low light performance with better ISO sensitivity. Now, that's just inherently because it's 12 megapixels, but I think all the Sony cameras are getting really good now, so that gap is really closing. There may be a point in time where a 12 megapixel sensor is no longer required to have that good low light, so we'll definitely get there one day. You also get 4K up to 120p in the S3. I just wish they would give us 120p RAW over HDMI. You get RAW up to 60p, and you get HD 240p. Plus, as I mentioned, you get dual CF Express Type A slots and a better viewfinder. The A7 IV does get Bird AF and a few other features, but those will be addressed in A7S III firmware, I hope. So this camera hasn't had an update in about a year, so I'm hoping that I'm right about that. Or I think you're gonna have a bunch of S3 users that are gonna be pretty upset about it. All right guys, so those are my thoughts on this camera, which seems to be amazing, and I can't wait to add it to my kit. Please let me know in the comments below if you plan on picking up the A7 IV, and if not, why. As always, if you liked the video, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel for more content just like this, and hit that notification bell if that's something you're into. That's a wrap. Ooh, that shit's good. That was tiring. I moved my set, by the way. It took me a while to get it where I wanted it, but I'm still gonna move the camera angle. I'm not really feeling this angle too much. I did get the anamorphic Siri, I don't know, I forgot how to say it. But I did get that 50mm T 2.9 full frame anamorphic. It is a beast. Can't wait to use this on my next music video. Guess we're gonna improve our manual focusing abilities here soon. All right.